Hey guys, welcome to the first episode of Conversations. I'm Antonio, the founder and CEO of dYdX. I wanted to start this podcast because I've honestly gotten pretty bored listening to any given person be asked the same questions and have the same responses on pretty much all the other podcasts that they're on. With Conversations, I want to ask people things that I am personally interested in without having them spend a lot of time giving their background or context or anything like that. For any of our guests, I'm sure you can find all that stuff on pretty much all the other podcasts that they're on. I also want Conversations to feel like an actual conversation rather than just me asking a stream of questions to the guest, because I feel like this just helps a lot getting deeper and getting to the really interesting stuff. Our first guest is going to be George Zeng, who is our COO here at dYdX. George has pretty much done it all. He graduated from Princeton. He worked in finance at Goldman Sachs. He's worked in consulting at places like McKinsey, product management at Facebook, and he's even started his own company in Moonship. George was actually the first person I've ever worked with on dYdX, and fast forward to about a year ago, he joined as our COO. In addition to his stellar resume, George is a really good friend of mine, and I always find his thoughts to be super insightful, so I hope you will too. So, without further ado, let's jump in. Hey, man.
Hey,
Welcome.
it's good to be here.
Good to have you in New York. How have you been doing?
I've been doing good. I mean, I think nothing beats summertime in New York, right? We chat about how there's like a whole pop song about it, and I really feel it when I'm here in the summer. It's just like so lovely here.
Yeah, it's been super nice. Well, I'm kind of just going to go through, ask you some questions. Feel free to respond. Feel free to include me in the conversation if you feel like I have anything useful to say. But maybe we can just kind of jump right into it and just like imagine that you're only talking to me.
Let's go. The harder, the better.
Yeah. For those that don't know, George has been the COO at dYdX for a little over the past year now. And I guess the first thing I'd ask you is, how's it been? Like, what do you think have been some of your biggest learnings in the past year?
It's been fantastic. So I feel like I've been in different companies in different stages and different roles before, right? I was like at a big company like Facebook, helping to build out things like the ad tech teams there. I've been a founder before for small startups, right? Upwards of like 6 to 10 people. And then I feel like dYdX has been an in-between stage, because when I joined, we were like 15, 16 people, and now we're like 50 plus. Mm-hmm. And it's crazy that that's happened over the past year or so, right? So we more than like approximately tripled or more than tripled in size like last year. And I've just like learned different things, seen a different side to the startup scaling journey. I've certainly learned a ton from you, because watching you, how you operate and run a company as a founder, and seeing that differently from the way I did things, gave me a whole bunch of new ideas that I don't think I would have had I not seen someone else in the founder seat like real time and day in, day out. So it's been really, really cool.
Cool. Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. I'm going to ask about that in a second, but I'm curious, and obviously I've experienced some of this too, right? I've been here the whole time with the company growing, but what do you think you've learned as the biggest thing from going from like 15 or 20 people to 50? Like, how is the company most different from your perspective?
I feel like one of the things that dYdX has done an extraordinary job of has been hiring very top quality A+ people. I feel like everyone says they do this, but I think dYdX has actually done this, right? It's been really, really exceptional, because I feel like when you hire really top quality people, you learn things from just being around those folks that you otherwise wouldn't. It's the whole iron sharpens iron sort of thing, right? Second thing that I've been sort of thinking about for quite a bit, which I think you do really, really well, something I learned from you this past year, is I tend to be very, very data-driven and logic-driven in my thinking. And I've, over the past year, have like started to unlock and think about what it means to be intuition-driven, right? And lean into, I remember you told me this because I was curious how you thought about it. You said that you observe your feelings and use your feelings as a way of like making decisions, but making sure that you do diligence and you back up the feelings with like really thoughtful work, analysis, and other stuff. But the seed of the action is the feeling. And I feel like that's the exact opposite of like what I've been taught my whole entire life, which is like, don't feel, suppress your emotions, just be a logical robot. And that's actually been a big change and big unlock for me.
Yeah, that's been super interesting. I want to come back to the A players thing because I have some questions about that. But first, we can talk about the intuition thing. I feel like that's been super interesting. Like, I've almost figured that out for myself in the past year.
Yeah.
Like, I think I have been doing that for a long time.
Yeah.
It's like, what do people mean by intuition? It's like, okay, step one, you just feel something. You're like sitting in a product meeting or some decision happens and you're like, it's like, doesn't really feel right. Or, oh, somebody had this idea and wow, that's actually excites me. So it's like step one, like feel the thing.
Yep.
And then like step two, like figure out like why you're feeling that thing and almost like justify it for yourself. But once you get enough practice doing that, I feel like you just get in this pattern where you can like trust your feelings more because you just have had so much experience with like feeling something and then later your thinking mind comes in and just like rationalizes it all. But you almost can kind of like assume that that's going to happen.
Yeah.
So you can just stand there in front of like the whole company or whoever it is and be like, oh, like feel this thing, immediately do it. I assume I can like figure everything out and like back it up later.
Yeah.
And kind of just operate like that.
Yeah. See, the funny thing is, if you haven't done this a lot before, you can feel like you're being intellectually dishonest by like going back and back feeling,
Yeah,
like back justifying like a feeling.
Yeah.
But if you're feeling something, it's probably processing a lot of subconscious thoughts and feelings and observations you've had.
Yeah.
What? This is probably like super silly, and I guess maybe shows you how I've like not been emotional for large parts of my life. But my therapist showed me this thing called the emotion wheel, and just being able to go through the emotional wheel and more accurately verbalize and understand how I'm feeling at any point in time has actually helped me to better understand and be more specific about like my emotions. And that's actually been helpful for me to unlock more feeling-based, intuition-based decision-making too.
That's interesting because I've always felt like I'm just like all the way on the thinking side of the spectrum too, right? I think probably we both are.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's useful. I almost just kind of feel like because I'm such a thinking person, like the feelings that I do have and like feel strong enough about, even if I'm just like, oh, this feels like bad in this product meeting, right?
Yeah.
Like that's not a super descriptive way to say exactly what I'm feeling, but almost just that like, oh, this is good or this is bad or like yes or no.
Yeah.
Like you're probably right. Like probably developing that like emotional vocabulary, even just for the sake of decision making, is good for you too. But I almost just feel like even some of those base level feelings can really drive intuition too.
Yeah. But see, double clicking what you said there, I think it's like fascinating, right? I used to use a lot of words, emotional words, like I feel bad, right? Then after having a little bit more specificity, I could be like, oh, I'm feeling anxious about our growth plans because, it's unclear to me that they're bearing fruit, right? Like going that one level deeper of specificity has helped me understand kind of like why I feel the way I do and actually get more specific into my actions as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, where have you kind of ended up? Kind of, you mentioned you came into it as like super data driven.
Yeah.
Now you're sort of seeing there's this other path. Like, do you think both are useful? Like, how do you kind of operate today?
Yeah. I just made a ton of realizations in the last few months. Like, I grew up, I was like a super nerdy third grader, but I read a book about stoicism in third grade, and I was like, I want to be a stoic. I want to be like logic based, not really emotional. But I realized I'm a lot more emotional than I ever realized. So actually going through the emotional wheel and being more specific about verbalizing my emotions has allowed me to, like the way I approach it now is I just embrace my emotions. I embrace my emotions and I try to verbalize it in my professional and my personal life more. And I feel like it's been going great. It's like led me to be more intuitive in a lot of different things. Even my wife has mentioned that she's noticed a difference in terms of like how I think and how I act.
That's great. I mean, I mentioned this to you before, but the more I kind of learn and have done professional coaching and like life coaching or therapy or whatever, the more it all seems like all this stuff is just like the same thing. And it's almost like I feel like people come into it and they're like, oh, I want to have my like job for 8 hours a day or whatever, and then I'm going to focus on my friends for like average of 2 hours a day in my relationship or kids or whatever. But I feel like they're not actually like disparate things. Like, it's sort of like a balance, and you got to like use your intuition. Like I was talking to my friends last week about how I feel like this has helped me in like dating and stuff, and it's like, I think I said something like, oh, like you want to be clear about your like values and goals and expectations. And then they were like, oh, okay, but you got to be careful not to give like OKRs to your girlfriend. But like, it's like, yes, that's probably not the right like tactical strategy you should take. But there's probably like some relationship version of like, okay, let's like be clear about like what we want to get better at, and it's like what we want to focus on and stuff.
You could probably have goals in your relationship without calling them OKRs, and they would probably end up helping the relationship.
Exactly. Yeah, it's been super interesting, and I feel like as thinking people, which I feel like most founders I know, not everybody, but like most founders I know are like more from that side. It's like interesting, like why it's so sort of looked down upon to like act based on feelings, and which is arguably the same thing as like intuition and stuff. Like, why is that not more prevalent throughout society, or at least like high functioning tech people?
It's a really good question. I actually think you can think about this from a number of different perspectives. A lot of tech folks are like math and science oriented folks. I hate to get stereotypical, but like if you're in the math and sciences, oftentimes it's like a very logic-based profession.
Yeah.
Because professionally it's so logic-based, it's easy to sort of bring that over to the personal side as well. But there's a lot of examples of people who like use a more emotional, intuitive-based stuff, right? Like Steve Jobs, arguably like one of the greatest tech leaders in our generation, super emotional. Right.
Mm-hmm.
This is mentioned a lot of different times. And now that I think of emotions basically as like it's a way to delve deep into kind of like your subconscious, and kind of all of these additional factors that like are, haven't quite risen to the surface of your brain. I definitely see it as a superpower, right? I feel like any leader that's in touch with their emotions and is able to act based on those emotions in addition to logic, just has an additional tool in their tool belt.
Yeah, and I almost came at it from like exactly the opposite way of you. Like you sort of maybe observed it working and then thought through, oh, like this for all the reasons you just said, like our reasons, emotions could be valuable and I should pay more attention to it. I almost feel like I came at it because I'm extremely lazy. I'm serious. Like, and I was just like, okay, what is the way I can operate by putting in the least amount of work? And it's almost what I was describing, right? It's sort of like a shortcut. It's like, okay, step one, just like immediately feel what you're feeling, which is like cost you zero basically, because it just happens automatically. And you don't have to think about it too much, and then you're just kind of like act based on that. And if you have to, like absolutely you have to like backfill the reasoning and make sure people understand why you're doing things and not just be doing things that are completely based on emotion and not logic. But that's kind of like the reason why I started doing it. And everybody in Silicon Valley is like data. And like, yes, I know data can be valuable too, and we definitely use it, but like, honestly, I'm just kind of lazy. So like we didn't use it too much like earlier on, and we're kind of getting better about that, right?
Yeah.
But then I guess I got better at sort of this intuitive decision making because of that, and then just kept going well, and it seemed like there was something there, and then I feel like I sort of almost the same thing, just like figured out why that was the case over time.
Yeah, that's true. I think you can come at it from a different angle. I think actually if you're lazy and you use that laziness as a motivation for efficiency and working smart, that can be a superpower. And it's just like a calibration. I think that if you are intuition based, you can actually be way off base if you don't inform it with some data occasionally.
Right.
If you're database, you may never actually reach deep down into the things that don't have good data backing behind them.
Yeah.
Right.
And I feel like we're kind of coming at it from this path because we're both super thinking people. So like maybe this doesn't apply to everybody. Like maybe if you're already just like pretty deep on the feeling side, like yes, you should get better at like feeling and classifying your feelings, but like maybe it's actually better for you to just like think about the first principles thinking side.
Yeah. But you know what? I bet you many people are bad at this because I actually think it's a cultural construct too.
Mm.
For example, when I was reading some of the books we talked about, right? They talk about how like, men are trained to, from when you're a little kid, don't cry,
Yeah.
Don't talk about your emotions, all this other stuff. So I bet you like many men are really bad at this.
That's probably true.
And many of them probably could benefit from being more in touch with their emotions and using emotions as like an intuitive decision-making tool as well.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I don't think a lot of people make that connection between intuition, which has, at least for like thinking people or men or whatever, like a pretty positive connotation, right? If you're just like somebody with good intuition, like, yeah, of course you want to have like good intuition, but like, is that actually the same thing as feelings? Like, I think they're at least super related.
Yeah.
Like, arguably maybe the same thing.
Yeah. I didn't realize it until you brought it up in that conversation we had. That was like, holy shit. Yes, those emotions and those feelings can be the basis of like intuition.
Right.
Yeah.
For sure. Okay, I want to go back to something you mentioned before with the like A players only. I do think we have done a good job of that, but I'm curious, like, why do you think that's so unique? Like, it seems like everybody at least pays lip service to this and sort of like believes it at a high level, but like throws it out the window when they have to compromise on something. Like, why do you think we've been able to do a uniquely good job of that?
I actually think a lot of it has to do with like holding the line. And I think you've just done a better job of holding the line than most people have, right? There's a lot more to it too. Like some of the roles we had to hire for, like we've talked about, right? Like those roles have remained open for a long period of time because we've just focused on finding the right person, right? I think that's part of it. Part of it is like, some of the folks who are on the team now, you've been talking about joining dYdX for years, right? If you think about it from that perspective, it's kind of crazy, but it's kind of, I think you always have to play the long game.
Yeah, I think that's what it is. I think it's really about the time horizon that you look at.
Yeah.
Like, I would actually point to like most of the things that I do as the big difference being like, what time horizon are you thinking about? Like, usually I'm thinking about things on like a 5 to 10 year plus time horizon.
Yeah.
And then I'm like, well, okay, if we don't hire a designer for literally an entire year, which that's happened at dYdX, it's like still fine actually, because that's still probably like, okay, well, we can either, let's just imagine that dYdX is going to exist for like 10 or 15 years. Okay, we don't have a designer for 1 year, so that's like 10% of dYdX. Would I trade not having a designer for 10% of dYdX for like finding a designer that's like 25 or 50 or 100% better? Like, yes, like of course you would make that trade, right? Like, but it's always hard to not get too invested in the short-term stuff that's going on, right?
Yeah.
It's like, we used to have Bryce, who's one of our staff engineers, like doing design. It's like sort of ridiculous. And we did sacrifice for that, but I feel like it is sort of just not compromising. And it's like, but I think the reason for that is the like time horizon thing.
Yeah. There's a lot more to this as well, right? You brought up the example of Bryce. Bryce worked with dYdX early on, and Bryce came back.
Yeah.
That's the biggest vote of confidence you can have for a team, a culture, like a leader and leadership team, right? We worked together early on as well. I was like, man, I really want to work with Antonio like more someday, right? And I think like Evil also worked a little bit with the team a little bit early on. So there's many examples of essentially different members of the team working with the folks at dYdX with you early on, wanting to continue to work with the team. And I think that's actually a really important part of it. It's like basically retention, right? It's retention, and it's like people wanting to continue to work with the folks that they've worked here. So there's something about that from a cultural perspective that I think is really, really important. There's plenty of people where like the people who worked at startup before never want to work at that startup again, right?
Yeah, probably like most jobs.
Right? Yeah. And if that's the case, that's really bad because, essentially you have like poor retention, right?
Yeah, I think there's like more to it than that too. I think a lot of this stuff, like I just did what was easy, to be honest. And I think just with the way I am, like one of the things that was easy is having deep connections, but with a smaller amount of people. And then, okay, well, it's just like, that's the way I am. So like, how could you possibly make a startup work if you just like don't even know that many people and you're not going to go out and network and you don't want to go out and recruit super heavily? It's like, okay, well, your like hit rate better be like pretty damn high on like the people that you actually care about and want to work with. And fast forward to today, I think that's been like relatively successful. But I think that's almost like where I came from, and so it's like the same answer as to the previous thing. It's like, okay, just like figure out the way that you are, and then like figure out how you can achieve your goals like based on the way that you are, even if it's non-standard. Like, I think that's like the biggest difference.
I actually didn't know that that's how you thought about recruiting, but I think that makes a ton of sense. I think it's a really good fit for kind of like how you work.
Yeah.
I also have to say, like, I think we're a little bit fortunate to be in crypto too.
Yeah.
Because people in crypto tend to be like religious about crypto. It's like many of us crypto folks had a moment where like you read like the Bitcoin or the Ethereum white paper and you couldn't stop thinking about it for like months or years, right?
Yeah.
So I do feel like there's an extra level of like zeal of like, dedication for people in crypto.
Yeah. I mean, I was going to ask you a little bit more about that. Maybe we can talk more about that later, just like startups and how do you choose an industry and stuff.
Yeah.
I guess we can just go there right now. Like, yeah, one of the things I've been thinking about more recently is, thinking a little bit more beyond dYdX and like, how can I help like other founders and how can I be a good like coach and advisor and stuff. And as I've been talking to people that are pretty early on, it seems like the biggest question is always like, well, what do I build?
Yeah.
Like, what idea am I actually going to do? So like, what do you think is the best advice for like very early stage founders based on like who are wondering like what idea should they do? Because I feel like so many people get stuck in this.
This is like a really, really good question. By the way, I think it's also a question that you'd be really, really well suited for to be like an advisor or like help folks think through. So I'm glad you're sort of thinking through this right now. I think most people fail in this dimension because either they build something that people don't want, or they build something that people don't want bad enough, right? And the second situation is almost like more difficult. If you build something that people kind of want, but not badly enough, you can fool yourself into thinking that you kind of have hit product market fit for a long time,
right?
And you can waste like years and years and years of your life.
Yeah, it's almost like a medium or mediocre outcome is actually way worse than like a really bad outcome.
Yeah. If no one wants what you're selling, right away, and you can at least move on. But if people kind of want what you're selling and you waste 5 years of your life on it, that's like definitely a lot worse than the former, right? I think there are I don't think there's like one way to build something that people really want or like the demand for something is big enough, right? I'll give you a couple of like benchmarks I've noticed or like rules of thumbs I've noticed. Both from like investing, advising, helping startups over the years.
Yeah.
One really common benchmark people have is if you know the problem and feel the problem yourself, that's a really, really good benchmark to have, right? Like, we're in crypto. I'll just take an example. We know that a lot of crypto companies are having problems getting banking services, right? This is something that we know very deeply. Because we know it so deeply in our bones, let's say someone from dYdX left someday to build a crypto banking company. Very reasonable sort of direction to go in, given like how we've seen this sort of go up, right?
That's a good point. Yeah.
Second, something I've been like obsessed with for a very, very long time. Paul Graham wrote an article about how there's like something called schlep blindness. Have you heard about this before?
No.
So the whole idea is like, if an entrepreneur wants to build a startup idea, they'll always go for the easy, hacky thing to do, right? Okay. It's like, if I can build something that's like super easy to build and it's going to be successful right away, I'm going to build that versus I'm going to do the really hard thing that requires a lot of heavy lifting, right? And a lot of the best startups that have like solved the deepest problems and have generated the most value, like Stripe, like Flexport, like Deal, they actually solved a very obvious problem. But what they did is they did like the really heavy lifting required to make the idea work. Like Stripe, they ended up working with banks. deal, they end up working with all of these countries and their like labor regulations.
Yeah.
And Flex support all of like the heavy lifting around like shipping and logistics, right?
Right.
So I actually think if entrepreneurs think about it from the standpoint of like solving for schlep blindness, doing the things that like are difficult to do, that's a really, really good benchmark for building something that like people want as well. There's a lot of other stuff to do as well, like considering market sizing, et cetera, as well. But those sometimes lead you astray because market sizing right now might not be the real true market sizing when you've actually built the product and the industry has evolved a little bit more as well.
Yeah.
Right.
That makes sense. I mean, it's almost like a time horizon thing again.
Yeah.
Like, I feel like that's probably the biggest thing for founders that I try to help people think about is like, what do you want? Like, what do you actually want? Like, why are you doing this? Like, do you want to like run a team that's like 50 to 100 people and you'd be like satisfied with that as an outcome? Do you want to like make some money and you're like satisfied with the tens of $1,000,000 like acquisition offer? Like, all of these things are totally fine. Do you want to like go for the moon and like build a unicorn, like, and it's like unicorn or bust or whatever? Like, I feel like you sort of just need to like figure out like what you want, and that should also be a pretty big input to what you want to build.
Yeah. Well, I'll turn the question on you. When you built dYdX, the derivatives market for crypto was like very nascent.
Yeah.
Right. What gave you the confidence that this is something that you should spend your time, your precious time and life on?
Well, I mean, I've put the story out publicly before about like kind of how I came to the idea. I think it was something where it just made sense to me.
Yep.
Like, I was totally sold on Ethereum, right? And so I was kind of looking for something to do, and sold in the sense that like it both just kind of made sense, and I felt like for a lot of reasons it would become a lot bigger over time. So it almost felt like anything that you would build on crypto, back then in 2017 would become way bigger. And then it's like, okay, so like what can work today? And then like if it works today at like any level, then it should become like way bigger in the long term. And then it was like, okay, well, like clearly derivatives are a really big thing in finance in general. Like crypto is mainly used for finance. Like therefore, like derivatives should become a big thing in crypto.
Yeah.
There were some of them back at that point in time, but they were really small compared to spot. So that was kind of like first insight. And then second insight is that it was a pretty natural fit for smart contracts as well. So I think it was like those two things. I mean, you could ask me like, why was I so convinced that crypto would become bigger? Because that's sort of like a key assumption too.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. Like, I guess like maybe I was just like kind of caught up in like the hype train of like the people that I was around.
Yeah.
There was some evidence, like from 2015 to 2017, things actually did become a lot bigger in percent terms in terms of like the way crypto was growing, right?
Yeah.
And then it sort of like made sense from a technical perspective. There were like really great people that I really respected, like Fred and Brian and Olaf, that are like out there saying this is the future and stuff. So that gives you some confidence. But I guess it's probably just all those things put together. It's like this. And I think the other thing was like nobody else. I felt like I knew something that people didn't know. Like I think it's maybe harder to like know something that people don't know unless you are either really early in a technology or you're just like a deep industry expert, like already building something and like viscerally feel the thing, like you were saying before.
Yeah.
But yeah, either of those two can work.
I'll share a couple other things with you which you may or may not have heard of before. I actually had a conversation with Avichal from Electric Capital at one point in time. He said that for a lot of entrepreneurs, founders, they feel like there's this thing that should be different in the world. And they feel it so strongly that, obviously things should work a different way.
Yeah.
And that strong feeling actually propels them to take an action to found a company, right?
Yeah.
Alon has like a different way of saying this, which is like, he says like founding companies oftentimes, I think this is the quote, like an act of desperation.
Mm-hmm.
But I think also, I'm not sure if you heard them say this, but like, I also think you might have been uniquely suited to start dYdX when you did, because just talking to Linda from Scalar Capital, she said that you were one of the best engineers that she saw at Coinbase. And I think plenty of people try to tackle this problem around 2017, 2018. Like most of those guys are not around anymore, right?
Yeah, yeah, that's true. That's true. I mean, there certainly needs to be like a quality bar that you have to hit in
Yeah,
order to like build something.
yeah,
I mean, you should be introspective too. Of like quality is there's a lot of different dimensions you can be high quality in, right? Like maybe you're an awesome engineer, but you like suck at sales or something. Well, if you go out and try to build a sales company, then
yeah.
like you're not going to do that well. But like the hard part of building dYdX is really on the tech side, certainly at least for the first like 5 or 10 years. So I think I was a good fit for that.
Yep.
And it's also like realizing what the competitive dynamics. This isn't a blanket statement for literally everybody in crypto at the time, but especially back then, I feel like crypto was just like a ton of hackers, right? And there are some really amazing hackers, but probably the like average engineering quality of like some random hacker is like way lower
Yeah.
than your average like top Silicon Valley engineer or whatever.
Yeah.
So I feel like that's part of it as well.
That's changed a little bit now, but that statement probably still true today.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, for sure. Okay, welcome back. Half two. So we were talking about starting a startup and advice to founders and stuff. One of the things that happened early on is I started dYdX by myself, as you know. And one of the cool things that happened early on with dYdX is you cold reached out to me to offer to help me with dYdX pretty much like in the first couple months. I think you emailed me like, hey, fellow Princeton grad, like wanting to help out with dYdX or something like that.
Oh, that's right. You remember the
And I
email.
was like, who the hell is this guy? But then you basically just offered to like help out on the weekends for free, like no agreements or like anything like that. Like my question is like, why did you do that?
You know, I've had so many people in my life I love the entrepreneurial ecosystem, right? There's so many people that have went out of their way to help me, like Avichel, like I don't know, probably hundreds of people at this point in time, right?
Mm-hmm.
If I can essentially pay it forward, and I see it as like, all entrepreneurs are like a brotherhood, sisterhood of folks helping each other out. We're not like really competing against each other. We're competing against the market, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's a very different dynamic, I feel, than many other industries. When I worked in finance, I oftentimes felt like there was like this inherent competition between people work in finance, between you and your colleagues on finance, right?
Yeah.
Whereas for entrepreneurs, you're really competing against the market. You're
Right.
competing against hitting product market fit, right? And so many people think about like, dude, how kind and helpful Brian, Fred, Olaf, all these folks were,
Mm-hmm.
right? I feel like that's a part of the entrepreneurial culture that I really, really love and value, and I really love paying it forward. So when I reached out, I feel like, man, it would have just felt bad if I was like, hey, let's like get a equity, whatever relationship in place or whatnot, right? I felt like if I could help you on your journey to be a successful entrepreneurship, even in a small way, that it would be like a pleasure and an honor, right? And then after I met you and chatted with you and started working with you, I was like, man, I think I could work really well with Antonio. I chatted with you about this before, right? But like my dream is one day to, not worry about money for my family and maybe like hopefully kids at some point in time. And what I would do is I would just work on cool stuff with people I really enjoyed being around for the rest of my life.
Yeah.
Right. And I really enjoy working with you. I really enjoy working with the folks at dYdX. So a lot of those components are already in place. So even from those early days, I felt like, hey, this is really cool. I think what Antonio is building is really, really cool. I think I really enjoy working with Antonio. Like in a steady state, I would love to work with Antonio and other folks. Like I do it for free and without worrying about money for the rest of my life if it's something I could do.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly appreciate that, and that makes sense. I think that's like an interesting point about like tech being more like positive sum almost, and like we're all in it together versus finance and potentially some industries either being like zero sum or pretty competitive. Like I often have felt that that really affects the culture of tech companies, right? And we've had some people join that have come from finance. And I've talked to Evo a lot about this, who's our director of strategy, who has worked at like Bridgewater and D. Shaw and stuff, and not to call those out specifically, but just finance in general, right? It's just like very, almost like competing against everybody else. And in tech, it's I feel like it's sort of become a meme. You know, like if you watch like Silicon Valley, the TV show, it's like every fucking tech company is like, and to make the world a better place. And it's sort of a meme, but it's almost like it is sort of like positive some like that too. And that's why I feel like you have a lot of emphasis on the culture and the like mission of all these companies and stuff.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. Like, we chatted about this, I think, earlier at lunch. There's a reason why San Francisco Silicon Valley always has such a special place in my heart.
Mm-hmm.
It's just because these people who, they want to make a difference in the world, they want to make money, they want to do all this other stuff, but like they really are motivated about like creating something, right?
Mm.
The act of creating something is the act of like imparting some part of like your values, your beliefs, your ideals. If you do it well, it's like a gift you give to humanity, right? Mm-hmm. I think that's like really, really important for a lot of folks in tech. I think it's a part of the Silicon Valley ethos, and I think it's definitely more common on the West Coast than it is on the East Coast.
Yeah,
right.
I feel that as well. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and say that like we're doing this, or at least I'm doing this for like entirely altruistic reasons. But I do think that there is something to be said for like you literally created something out of nothing, and like that matters in like some way, right? Like that's sort of how I think about it.
I 100% agree. dYdX should exist in the world. I strongly believe that.
Yeah.
Right? Whereas when I worked in finance before, I sometimes came home and was thinking to myself, like, what did I do with my life today?
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
I just moved money around a little bit, and then that was pretty much my day. But like, I feel like if you build crypto and you build blockchain the right way, you can actually create a very valuable financial infrastructure that's like helpful for a ton of people, right? That's something that gets me excited and like jump out of bed in the morning.
Yeah, I definitely think that's true. I mean, maybe not quite as bad as working in finance, but when I was working at Uber for a little bit, even that's like a tech company, but it was like 2,000 people at that point in time and stuff. And I was just biking in. I'm like, what the hell am I doing? Like, I'm not really creating like anything in the world that like new replacement engineer could not create in the same way that I did.
Yeah.
And it's like, I don't know, like I'm getting a little bit philosophical here, right? But like, what is the point of like any of this, right? It's you got to figure it out for yourself. But I feel like one common way to like make a point for yourself in life is to make an impact, right? And you don't have to create a tech company. You could like create art or like a company or kids and just like make them more like yourself and like sort of export your values to them. But I feel like that is sort of like a core like human thing of like wanting to do something that matters.
I agree with you. But I'll take your example of Uber, right? Uber's mission at some point in time is something like commoditize or make transportation universal or something like that, right? I think that's an incredibly valuable mission.
Yeah,
right?
For sure. Yeah.
And here's the other funny thing. I think for entrepreneurially minded folks like us and a lot of folks at dYdX, I think actually the product and the company and entrepreneurship is our art, right? Like the same way, like a good rapper creates a good rap song or a rap album, or like a painter creates a good painting. I think for a lot of entrepreneurs, creating a product and creating a company that like does something valuable in the world is like their artistic expression.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I don't know very much about art, to be honest. I've learned like a little bit about it. Some artists sort of like talk about this like headspace that they want to be in to like create art. And it's probably slightly different than making decisions at a tech company, but I almost have been learning it's sort of like the same thing. It's like, how do you actually make better decisions? We talked about it some, but a big part of it is like being in the right headspace to make decisions. And I feel like it's sort of very similar.
Yeah, 100%. 100%.
Yeah, makes sense. All right. What else have we got here? Okay, this is somewhat related, but I wrote a section on life goals. So what are for you personally some of the biggest things that you want to do in your life or want to achieve, and why do you think those are the biggest things that you want to do?
One of the things I want to do is I want to create financial security for my family, right? So my mom and dad came over from China with, this is like, I feel like such a stereotypical story, but with basically nothing, right? Like when they first came over, we were surviving on like, I don't know, like $300 a month or so, right?
Yeah.
My mom, who was like a, trained computer scientist, mechanical engineer, couldn't get a good job when she came to the US. So she would go into a candle factory and pour hot wax into candle molds, right? And she would assemble heavy machinery, do all of this stuff just to like be able to pay enough, make enough money to like buy food and stuff for us, right? I feel like maybe this is like potentially like a very Asian thing, but I feel like a deep sense of obligation to my parents, right? Like my mom would come home with like candle wax burns, and like even think about it now kind of like makes me tear up a bit, because I want them to be able to live the rest of their lives like, doing whatever they want with their lives, not because they have to like provide for a family, right? I also want to be a good dad, good like husband, right? It's something that I sometimes feel a little bit insecure about because like I'm not very good at emotional stuff. But my parents were working all the time. I kind of think it'd be really cool if I could like help do stuff with like my kids. Take them to sports, maybe help them start their own company, do like a father son, father daughter kind of like entrepreneurial thing. That'd be kind of cool. And then other than that, I want to be able to work with people I really like working with on building impactful products and companies for the rest of my life. Like it's what we talked about earlier. Once the family stuff is taken care of, I feel like if I could just work with awesome people, like build products, build companies, invest, advise, do that kind of stuff for the rest of my life, I'd be very, very happy.
Yeah, well, you've sort of done the full arc in your career, right? Like, you started in finance, right? That was first at like Goldman and some other places. Then you did consulting at like McKinsey, and then you did big tech at like Facebook, and then now startups. Like, so you've sort of seen it all, right? Like, how do you feel like all of those different things like either aligned with your goals or didn't, and like why that evolution?
Yeah, I feel like there's like this, whatever, Newton's method for estimation where you try to guess a number. Let's say you try to guess 7 and you're like, oh, I'm guessing 3 and I tell you it's too low. And then you guess 11, I'm like too high. And then 6 too low, 8 too high, and finally you guess 7. There's like this process of elimination in that like method, right? I feel like I had to do that, go through this process to find out like, I believe deeply in product market fit for people, in addition to product market fit for products, right? My product market fits somewhere in the entrepreneurial tech world, right? But I think I had to try all of this other stuff to figure out that it wasn't a fit for me before I finally understood where I fit in the world.
But like, did you always think that you wanted to do tech and entrepreneurship, or you just had like no idea?
No idea. When we were like in Princeton, like entrepreneurship isn't a big thing. Right. It's not like Stanford or maybe some of the West Coast schools where like so many people go into entrepreneurship. I didn't even know it was like a viable life path until like years after I graduated, right? And then I had to like play around at the edges before I figured out that it was like actually pretty good fit for me. You know what I realized is potentially one of the best metrics for figuring out if you're a good entrepreneurial person or not. Okay. Here's my theory. Hear me out. Throughout my life and my career, everyone I've noticed has said to me, George, you're irrationally excited about uncertainty, right? You're just super excited about uncertainty because when I see uncertainty, I always think possibility. Right?
That's true.
It's like dYdX could build all of these things. It's uncertain what the future is, but that uncertainty brings with it like the possibility of we can create anything. And that's super, super exciting.
Yeah, but it's sort of like unique too, right? Like most people are really worried about uncertainty.
Bingo. So here's the really interesting thing. A bunch of my friends who are less a good fit for the entrepreneurial world, they get really stressed out and anxious about that uncertainty instead of excited by it. And I noticed that for a lot of entrepreneurial people, they're actually excited by the uncertainty.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's like, what is it, like 0 to 1 or something? It's like the startup is making decisions under extreme uncertainty. And if you just are excited by that, that's certainly a big competitive advantage. I mean, I think about things for like just startups and founders and almost life in general in terms of like having a really good understanding of yourself is actually really important.
100%.
And it takes a lot of time to do that a lot of the times, right? Because you just grow up and you're like, oh yeah, well, of course I am the way that I am. And it's probably other people are like some distribution around that. Like some things you're like, oh, actually, like I met all these people and they're like all over here in the distribution. And I'm like all the way over here. So like that's unique. So like what unique about me can I most use to
So
do something?
you said a bunch of things that are actually very unique about yourself. And you use that uniqueness for like recruiting, for decision making, etc. Right? How did you figure this stuff out about yourself? And how did you like apply it to decision making as well as you have?
I mean, kind of come full circle. I just did what was easy or what felt good, right? It's like easier
Laziness,
to
the answer
be
to life.
like, I don't know, unless you are like super self-deprecating or something. It's just like easier to be yourself than pretend to be somebody else, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, well, it's both easy in some ways because it's natural, but it also may be hard in the sense that like, oh, if you're worried that that's not the optimal thing to do,
Yeah.
you may like try to do something and be someone you're not.
Yeah.
And like, for example, I talk to a bunch of other advisors type people and like successful founders, and they're like, oh yeah, like founders, you have to spend like half your time recruiting.
Yeah.
That's just like the job of being a founder.
Yeah.
You just like got to go out there and like talk to everybody.
Yeah.
And like figure out the best ways to get the best people on your team because, like adding one new person to your team is literally multiplying like the throughput of your entire company versus you doing like 50% more stuff. That's like, who cares if that's like doesn't compare to adding 10 more people. And then you're like, oh man, like first of all, like they've been really successful with this, like so they must like be right, and it seems logical, but like I just like don't really want to like go out there and like talk to like tons of people and like network at conferences and stuff. And I don't know, like honestly, I'm just like kind of lazy, so I just like didn't. And then if it had gotten like so bad to the point where it was just like me after 2 years, I would have been like, okay, we need to at least do like 10 or 20% of this.
Yeah.
But like we actually had a good amount of success pretty early on with at least like fundraising and getting some key early people, and it like started to work. And then I was like, oh, okay, well, like I don't actually have to do this thing that I don't want to do. So it's just like only doing things you want to do.
Yeah. That's like really, really awesome that you kind of intuitively, I guess, use like what felt natural to you as a guide. For me, I mentioned like the trial and error process I went through. Kind of what I came to the conclusion is you can play like different games in life, right? And if you're going to play a specific game in life, play a game where like you like the rules, or the rules are stacked in favor of like your being able to do impactful things, right? You can play games that don't appeal to your strengths, don't appeal to like where the rules don't favor you, and that is just feels like a recipe for like going the wrong direction in life, right?
Yeah, and I have said this to you before, but I think talking about it, just like communicating something again, is a good way to understand it better for yourself. But this like theory I'm working on where there's like different paths in life, right, that you can go on. And let's just like take a simplified version of this, just like startup founders for the sake of arguments. Like there's lots of different types of startup founders, right? There may be really product focused, like product visionary ones. There may be like sales gods or whatever. There may be like recruiting gods and it's actually like really important that you figure out like which path is the best for you, like pretty early on. Like you sort of talked about this a little bit at like a higher level with like, okay, what industry do I want to work in? And that's almost like different paths. It's like, okay, if you work in finance, like you sort of know like the way your life is going to go, and you can look at more senior people and be like, is that who I want to be in like 10 years? Like, does that seem like what I, George, want to do or whatever? But you can think of that, this is almost like a life thing, right? Like even like startup founders, going back to that, there's different paths. But the key thing, so the first key thing is like figuring out which path that you want to be on. And then I feel like the second key thing, and I feel like a good amount of people like figure that out eventually, that's not like that unique. But then like the second thing that I feel like most people don't do is that once you figure out a path, you like only listen to people and like advice that are on that path. Because like actually if you listen to like the recruiting type founders and then you take 1/3 of what they tell you and then take 1/3 of what the sales type CEOs or founders tell you and 1/3 of what the product type founders tell you. Like the combination of 1/3 of those things is like somewhere that's like not on a path,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And I feel like so many people, I just like hear them, as a startup founder, get super excited and they're like, holy shit, like all these investors and advisors want to talk to me for the first time. It's amazing. And then they just get like super confused because they'll try to listen to everybody. And that's like almost worse than like listening to one or two people or arguably only yourself.
I 100% agree with that, plus 1,000 to what you said. I also think there's something that's very, very special about, like, let's say that you are a engineering-driven founder. There's something very special about taking the 3 best engineering founders that you're able to get a hold of and using them as your Sherpas. Because if you end up going to 10, you end up diluting the best advice and best insights.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and that's something that I just sort of got lucky again with, right? It's just like I said before, I just always prefer a smaller number of people, but like deeper.
Yeah.
So it was like for me, like I just sort of modeled myself after like Brian and Fred and Olaf, who I could like see myself being kind of similar to them, which is a good sign that they are on the path. They're like further than me on the path, but it's just like take the path and then like find people that are further along it and then like pick like 3 or 4 of them and like only listen to them.
Yeah. So this is like super interesting because this is one of the things I've actually learned from my time here at dYdX. Because there's like this emphasis on, when I worked at Facebook before, the job of a product manager, and you end up like interacting with a lot of people, but because of that you have a lot of meetings, there's a lot of like, a lot of your calendars fill up with just like these one-on-ones or group meetings and whatnot, right?
Yeah.
So one of the things that was super interesting is like kind of the work at dYdX showed me a potentially different way of doing things. One that's a lot less like meeting oriented, but one where you spend that time actually doing more like deep thinking, deep work, deep research, deep reading, or like these other types of activities. And it's very interesting because I think it's a different way of working, of running a company. And I think if a person's able to do different styles, different points of time for what they need, that's like a very, very powerful thing as well.
Yeah, I think that certainly is true. I mean, I think it depends a lot on what type of company we're building, right? Because we have like some decent amount of product market fit, but we think really long term, right? And we only have a 50-person team, right? Like if you were the COO of like 1,000-person company, like probably the like scope of everything that we needed to do in operations would just be like so big. But yeah, absolutely. Like, I think that's what like you can do, and like that's why you're a good fit for the role. One other question I wrote down, which is something that I've been thinking about, and I like don't actually have a good answer to, is what do you think makes a good executive of a tech company? Like, I feel like people talk about founders like all the time, and that's pretty well documented, but at least I haven't found that much on like executives. Like, it's clear, right? Like, an executive when you see it, right? And you like can see how they act. But sometimes I like try to do a thought experiment where I'm like, okay, well, why couldn't this like junior or even mid-level engineer be like the VP of engineering at dYdX? Like, what's so different about Kyle, our VP of engineering, from like some mid-level engineer? Like, what do you think the biggest things are?
This is a really interesting question. I think I can answer this question a number of different ways, right? Naval has a saying where like all the value in life comes from, I think his term that he uses is like specific knowledge, right? And the way he defines specific knowledge is like knowledge that like you can't be taught, right? Knowledge that you have to like figure out some way of gaining through experiences, through intuition, whatever the case may be, right? I actually think that to be, let's say, good senior leader at a company, there are like many different things you have to experience over time because there's no like textbook. Like take your example of like a VP of engineering. There's no textbook on how to be a good VP of engineering, right? I think you kind of actually have to go through the process of hiring engineers, firing engineers, mentoring engineers, building up teams, organizations. And that process of going through those experiences takes many years, right? So even if you have a super, super smart 22, 23-year-old engineer right out of college who's able to do the IC work, because they haven't gone through the cycles of hiring people, the difficulties of firing people, of building organizations and mentoring people, of like growing seniority themselves, it's really, really difficult for them to be a VP of engineering.
Do you think that's because there's like a lack of resources, or just like if you read like, oh, you should build the engineering organization this particular way in a book, that's not as impactful for you as like, oh, I tried to build it this other way and it like completely failed?
I think that there are certain things in life that have to be experienced to feel it and understand it in your bones.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't actually acquire that knowledge as deeply any other way, right? It's like being a founder, right? You can read a book about being a founder, but unless you've actually been a founder, you don't really get it.
For sure, for sure. I mean, I totally agree, and clearly experience is super important, but I feel like not that, or I haven't heard very many good takes on like why it's so important compared to just potential or like learning or something like that.
Oh, let's double click into this a little bit more. I think because there are many different philosophies of being a leader, right? For example, a VP of engineering is very different from a CPO, is very different from a CTO, very different from a CEO. Even a CEO is different if you're in enterprise SaaS versus like a generative AI company versus a nuclear fission company, right? So what happens is if you step in a senior executive leadership role, you come with it your own like playbook of how you do things, and you actually have weighting in your head of all the different things you could do, all the different knowledge and perspectives you can take, right? Let's say I go become CEO of an enterprise SaaS company. Well, I might have a view that, I need to build product by essentially doing deep customer development, and I need to build out like an effective SDR, AE sales team, right? And I believe that that's like the most impactful thing for me to do. And because I presume if I'm the CEO of an enterprise SaaS company, I've like kind of done this before. I've like seen it before, I understand it in a deep way, right? But if I just said, you need to, in order to be a, successful CEO of a tech company, you have to have like good customer development processes for customer research and AE and SDR sales structure set up. That might not be applicable to a social media company, but because if you don't have the experiences, you can't properly weight different information. I think so much of life is about weighting.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
You need to be able to weight information you're exposed to properly in order to know what aspects of the information you should trust more. And without the experience and the context of having gone through it, it's incredibly difficult to weight information.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. The only thing I would challenge you on, or maybe add as like a big category, is I feel like there's a lot of soft skills around being an executive, or which is basically just a specific form of being a leader, right? Like, what does it mean to be a leader? I feel like there's a lot of confidence, there's a lot of authority, which both is sort of given from other people, but like you also feel yourself. Like, obviously I feel a lot of authority for what I can do with dYdX, and some random engineer we plucked and put in my spot probably would not themselves like feel that level of confidence and authority. And like emotional maturity, like the stuff we were talking about before, like being able to connect with people, earn people's trust. Like I actually feel like that stuff is really important too. And that also, like I agree with you, is something that has to be like learned through experiencing it, rather than like you read in a book that you're like supposed to be confident or whatever.
Yeah. But some people are naturally more self-confident than others.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think there's like innate traits that make you a better founder or executive or like whatever.
Yeah.
But it's like, if you start with like better innate traits, then there's probably less for you to have to experience and learn in life. But like, you probably have to get to like some good place and all this stuff.
That's fair. That's fair. I definitely agree with that.
Yeah. Makes sense. What else do we got here? Okay, I guess kind of looking forward into the future. So we talked about some of the stuff we've learned in the past year at dYdX. What are the biggest things that you want to improve on in the future, and why?
Yeah, we've already talked about a lot of these, but probably the 2 or 3 biggest ones. One is the product that we work on at dYdX is incredibly technically complicated, right? And the space moves so quickly One of the things I want to go deeper in is just on the pure engineering aspects of like the work that we do, right? And, you know, not an excuse, but at times I find it challenging to do that if you have like a full day from like, morning to evening. Kind of what you have to do is you have to carve out like morning before you start or evening after you finish or the weekends. But actually being able to master that in the space is so important, so critical, right? Because it helps you navigate the future for the whole entire team, right? Us as like leaders for the team, if we lead the team in the wrong direction, we kind of like it spells doom for the entire company, for the entire protocol. Right?
Yeah.
So it's challenging to do, but I just see it as so important that I want to actually, I guess, like burn the midnight oil, if you will, to invest the time to do it.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, I think we're kind of getting to time, but I have one hopefully fun one to end on. What do you think the biggest difference between you and me is, and why?
You and I are like surprisingly similar in a bunch of different ways, right? The biggest difference between the two of us, I've noticed this a bunch of times. You and I come to very similar conclusions, but from like very different starting places, right? Which I think is really funny. The point we made about like intuition and like how you would recognize the importance of intuition. I'm surprised at how we came to a very similar conclusion, but from like a very, very different sort of starting place.
Yeah.
Right. I want to know your answer to that question too. What do you think is the biggest difference between you and I?
I would say the same thing basically,
Yeah.
and maybe to double click into like what are the differences in starting points. I feel like you're the like classic golden child overachiever. Just like go to the best school, work at like the best company in every industry, work super hard, like all of that, and I super respect that. And I feel like I've more just like gotten lucky.
No. I don't think it's luck. I think you've actually been very efficient, right?
I have been efficient. Yeah, I'll give myself some credit. But like, I'm like pretty surprised that I got into Princeton, to be honest. Like, I had like a 3.7 in high school.
Well, I mean, truth be told, as I get older, I actually want to learn more from the efficiency standpoint, right? I have a wife now, like, I have to think about family stuff in the future. I think if the efficiency standpoint, like, is a lot better for life long term, right? Rather than continue just.
I think it's both efficiency, but I think people like get too distracted by like, oh, let's work like fewer hours and like be more efficient and stuff. Like, I think that's true, but I think like people think that's true for the wrong reason. It's not like you're like better rested or whatever, so you can like work more efficiently. Like maybe for some people that's true.
Yeah.
But there's also certainly people that just know how to grind, right? And they can actually be really efficient like grinding, and you still have to compete against those people if you're doing something competitive.
Yeah.
I think it's like actually just it's easier to be authentic if you like don't work super hard.
Yeah.
It's like I'm not saying you're not being authentic or like anything like that, but you've sort of talked some about like, oh, you feel really driven to like by finding financial outcomes to like at least stability for like you and your family.
Yeah.
So it's like totally reasonable.
Yeah.
But it's like, okay, if you're probably coming from that perspective, it's like maybe a little bit harder to like think about like who you are, or just like do the thing that seems easy because you're so good at just like doing the thing that's hard that like you feel like you should do, and that's like totally a good way to do it. But I think it is sort of this unique way to do it, to just like just like be yourself and be authentic. And like, yes, we sort of like came to the same place eventually, but from like two different angles.
Yeah. There's like I feel like Naval is my philosophical Sherpa.
That
Naval has a way of saying this as well, which is like, if you essentially redefine what you do until it's something that like is supernatural and that you're best at, like no one can ever outcompete you against being yourself.
Yeah, and it's almost like you change the definition of like what you're doing rather than like necessarily focus only on becoming better.
Yeah, I like that a lot.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, man. Well, this has been great. I feel like I learned a lot. Thanks.
Same. Thank you for having me. Isn't that what they say on all the podcasts? Thank you for having me.